So I'm Dr. Sharita Hughes. I'm in Atlantic City, New Jersey right now. So I am coming to, I guess, where you are in theaters, so to speak. So I'm going to go ahead and get started because I believe that this is a really important topic, and I think it's interesting as well as useful because of the population that I'd like to center on today. So just to kind of make this a little bit more personable, what led you to step into the session today?
I work in a senior center. So we serve, diverse populations of older adults. I run a group that's centered around building, social connections, but we do a lot of different activities, whether it's more introspective or wellness focused. So kind of learning about just some different approaches that might be helpful.
Okay, well, good. Hopefully,
And
I'll
there's
be.
some other folks that are walking in the room as
Oh,
well.
great. I guess because I started like way on time. I know some people are like, hey, let's give a little bit of people.
Yeah.
Hi, is that Kathy?
Yeah. Hi.
I do. I hope I do know a few people, so it's nice to meet you. What's your name?
I'm Nicolette.
Nicolette. Hi, Nicolette. So I got Nicolette and I got Kathy. So I'm gonna still keep going. So hopefully today I'll be able to provide, and what my goal is to provide resources, to provide a background, and to share with you some I want to say empirical evidence on the resources that I'm going to share with you and why this topic is so relevant, especially as we are in this current I want to say the almost the racial and societal and political climate that we're in, and how we all are needing some support in helping one another from just a really a humanistic standpoint too, right? So going into this, let me see if I can go ahead and get to the next. So I like to start off with my takeaways just in case I don't make it to the end. So the biggest part of things today that I would like for you to take away is that it is so important to be culturally responsive in the plans of treatment that you are creating. And the way that you want to be able to do that is just being inclusive and considerate of sometimes the nuanced problems that are impacting the people who you are working with. And when you think about the people, the population that I'm discussing today are the more marginalized communities. And I like to say, when I think of or when I say marginalized, those people who are operating sometimes within the systemic problems that we've been facing or that they've been facing for years, generations at a time. And when I say community, I'm talking cultural groups. So I'm not just talking about going into a community, but the cultural group that makes up the community that we're looking at. And then number two, the constructs. So those constructs, I mean, like something like wellness, something like sometimes race, something like marginalization, when people are literally almost in a system where they've been hushed, where they've been silenced, and they have to just operate and navigate. Risk factors, protective factors, different things like that. That you want to definitely be able to keep in mind when we're looking at a community-based program, and the community-based program might be something like wellness, right? The whole approach to wellness, knowing that some we're looking at it maybe from a positive, collective, subjective idea of how to teach people, how to help them to maintain where they are in life, and definitely how to increase those practices. And I'll get into that because some of these constructs are already revolving around mental health and wellness counseling. That's what I do at my practice. So it's definitely mental health and wellness. Sometimes can it be looked at as maybe something interchangeable? Definitely yes, but you want to be able to home in what are we actually talking about when we say wellness, and then the quality of life. We're not looking at it just as general monolithic standpoint or perspective, but literally there's an assessment and an appraisal tool that you can be able to use, and that's one of the takeaways. So what can I do to better understand the subjective idea of what my clients are going through when we're talking about their quality of life. There's an assessment. The World Health Organization has one that's free online, and they also have their evaluative tool. How do I actually use this? And I like to use it as a pre and post test. So I can start with it at the beginning to see, well, what's this person's idea about their quality of life? And then after treatment or after weeks or after the program is done, we'll do it again and say, I'd like to, kind of really administer the qual again to see, hopefully, if it's improved or not, right? And so we're looking at, when you're thinking community-based programs, you got to have your benchmarks. You got to have, well, this is where we start. This is where we can kind of pinpoint some things that we're doing along this continuum. And then at the end, we want to reassess to make sure that our program is doing well. No pun intended. Okay. And so a little bit of background. So a lot of times when I'm discussing wellness, it's because of the research that I've done. I've done research using the wellness with, I want to say, relative to the indivisible self. I think a lot of people have heard about Whitmer and Sweeney Myers, Dr. Jane Myers. Dr. Jane Myers, I think it was her baby, the wellness wheel. Most people have heard of, right? It was from a framework that's really the only um I don't want to say it might not be right now, but for a very long time, and even just in the counseling profession, we homed in on using the indivisible self because it had the most evidence based ideas that came about for its use, and because it was theory based and it had its own assessment called the 5-factor wellness inventory. We're going to go into that, but so I used it in my research, and I have these 3 pictures here because it was really, I guess, what captured the background of the research that I've done. The athletes. This is so important right now. Even we're talking about the Olympics and these athletes that are coming to, and how, as a society, we just won't give them a break. Not to say that it's not all of us, but so the research study that I and a student who is now graduated, we have been working to understand the wellness of athletes, and it's so timely now. So that's where that came in, and the purpose was to be able to really get a better understanding of the landscape of where athletes were with relative to their mental health and well-being, so that we can help the coaches to be more in a sense, insightful, to be an advocate and to empower the athletes to go get help, and not just to wear it on their shoulders and thinking that they could not go get that help, and that it was something maybe um, that you had to kind of hide away from, right? Mental health and well being, what is that? I'm having a hard time with focus, anxiety, performance anxiety. So that's where that kind of came in. But then this other picture here to the far bottom right, excuse me, was over the last year, I had been doing some virtual groups, and I was trying to see what the wellness was, or at least what the state of well being was for people that were at home. So we had a lot of social anxieties and things like that. So that's where that came from. And then I wanted to put some programs together. Okay. So who is it that we're talking about? When we're talking 65 and up, who is this? A lot of people know people as who? Baby boomers. So do we have baby boomers in the room? Possibly. Uh,
Missed it by that much.
that much? Okay, so I wanted to make sure that I really just honed in on who was the population. We got to know them, right? The sociodemographic ideas. And according to the census.gov, I had to really go online. It's like, because this population changes sometime over time just by the way they're discussed. I don't think the population itself changes, but there's some really nice ideas, facts, and truth that we need to know about this population. This is the age group that literally has grown the entire population over time, right? Since 2010, the baby boomers who were born between 1946 and 1964 literally were responsible for the growth of the entire American population. What does that mean? They have grown from a third, which estimates 34%. That's close to 14 million people. Okay. That's big. So the national median increase, that growth literally grew the entire average age of the population. So and when you got to think of statistics, I guess, when we're looking at this. So 38.4 is the average age, but that number grew because of the baby boomers, right? Them being this larger growth. In 2019, baby boomers were actually more in number than the under 18 group. That's big. Okay. Where are the baby boomers? Where is this age group located in the United States? I found Maine, Florida, West Virginia, and Vermont. Literally 1 in 5 people were age 65. All right. And so the aging process literally comes into play within this group because they're now doing what? They're going into counseling, they're aging, the different processes from socially, cognitively, and physically. They're looking at these as major components in their lives, and it's been a really big impact. The other aspect is grief. I didn't put this on here because it was just something that over the last couple of months that I've been made kind of, I guess it's becoming more salient to me and the people that have come in. What are your thoughts, if anything? I can see Kathy right now. So, anything about grief and the grieving process for people who are baby boomers? Anything coming up?
I mean, for me, it was a change because some of my folks over 60 are having to work longer versus they thought they could retire sooner.
Sure.
So financial things. And then for my clients that are in that 60 range, and then their parents, and then they're in that sandwich generation, so to speak, with their children and the aging parents. And then with the pandemic, specifically the grief and loss of the isolation of not being able to visit grandma in the nursing home, of not being able to have a funeral, of not
Hmm.
being able to do the things that we expected and we thought we could do.
Right.
And then moving into your twilight of your life saying, well, I'm going to slow down, I'm going to retire, I'm going to do this and this. And the pandemic shut down things. I can't go to the gym, I can't go swimming, I can't, just losses on so many different levels, loss of going to religious services, even just in general, not just big rituals like a funeral, but
Hmm.
just loss of the normal.
Yeah, that normalcy definitely is almost out of the door, right? So when you think of the population, I want to go a little bit deeper because I'm talking, excuse me, primarily about those marginalized groups, right? And when you think about the civil rights era. These are the people who were having children, they were adolescents and young adults during this time, and now they're getting older. Now I'm a product of this group. So I talk about sometimes my mom and dad, who are both in their mid 60s to early 70s, right? It's like, wow, this was what they were doing when they were young, and we're talking about a lifespan here, right? And so it gets a lot deeper. So what were your experiences back during the civil rights era of the 60s, and how is that now playing out in your today current circumstances, making it a complexity of these different identity intersections? And then you already have those things that you're going through, like retirement, like the lack of normalcy of COVID. But then what are you also bringing into the picture, and what you went through early in life, how now things are coming to a head, right? And so when you think back with this population, what are the narratives? How are they looking back over their life and what they went through, and now saying, wow, this is what I went through and this is what I'm seeing. And a lot of times it's the same thing or what seems like the same thing. And I put some pretty nice pictures up. But this is who we're talking about now, right? So these people here sitting at the counter, they're older. They're coming to you. This is what they did then. This is what are they doing now, right? They're in our groups. So going to the Center of Disease and Control, I wanted to see, well, what was going on, right? It looked a little Marvin Gaye. So what's going on? So I like the fact that they're looking at it sometimes as just an overall problem. And that's why I wanted to really pinpoint this as a significant group because we're looking at the impact of the communities of color, right? And I don't want to just say the communities of color because that's why honestly I don't use BIPOC because it creates a false narrative that each one of these communities of color are doing or having issues and problems that are the same or doing well in the same areas when it's really not. So we have to be able to understand the different groups that make this up because they're not a monolithic group. So these deeply embedded problems within the society, but this holistic picture here of the inequities, of the different social economic benefits, housing, education, wealth, employment. You look at the whole wheel, right? If you knew anything about that wellness wheel going in, but you got to look at the overall health conditions. And so the research that I've been able to do and find out that these social determinants of health really impact the mental health. And as us as counselors, we see this mental health being a problem and it might be the center what brings them in, but what that's just the manifestation, right? We have to look at, well, what was the pathology that got them here? We're looking at those poor health outcomes. So when you look at that, you can see this model here going in. So when I was able to look at the research and the results that came in, it was the physical self and the essential self, which was really the pinpointers here. So looking from a framework, what was it about me that I did not want to be able to what? Dissect, but I knew we had to do a little bit of compartmentalization. So the indivisible. What do you think of Adler? Right? This whole big part of my whole composite self, but I want to be able to break it down to look at the individual pieces of it. So I had to do a little bit of appraisal. So what came out was the physical self for the women in this group. And if you look at what was the physical self, what did that mean? The exercise and nutrition. This is what the impact was. And then the essential self for the men. Look at the essential self, spirituality, self care. Self care is so big today. Gender identity, cultural identity. These are the things that really took a major hit. So if we're looking at, well, how do I help this population? And sometimes I might not always be a part of the cultural group, but doesn't mean that I can't help them because we're all in this together too, right? That's the humanistic aspect of it. So when I look at, well, what is it about your essential self? Let's even break that down a lot even further, right? And so when I get to a point of having that appraisal done, each one of these, when you're using the five-factor wellness inventory, gave me a number, right? And it might have been a lower number, what I was finding. So wow, it's like I want to start being able to create some type of form of treatment that can help you to increase that number over time. That's that quality of life or on that five-factor wellness inventory. So what was it about this? So going in, that was the only differences. So creative self, coping self, and social self, those were pretty stable and actually really high over time and in comparison to the norming group that the five-factor wellness inventory was literally used as far as coming up with the assessment. We're looking at sometimes out of the box, but those psychometric properties of an assessment tool. You want to look at the norming data too, right? So this group, they were actually a lot higher, but then these two, the physical and essential, were a lot lower. What was going on again? Okay. So that's where you can say, I'd like to zero in on that. How can I help these people improve the physical self and the essential self? And a lot of times it starts off with going into the contextual variables, we say. And I have this nice yellow pinpointer here I called myself giving you, because these are now I can go deeper into the discussion, right? I have elements to take into an account. You know, when we're doing a full case conceptualization and we first meet with someone. So when we're looking at the baby boomers or the 65 and up, go contextual, go into each deeper area. What is it? I want to have a full open discussion in order to give them the safe space in order to talk about these contextual areas. What is it? The local, the institutional, global, and chronometrical. I want to go now specifically. What is it about your family? Tell me something about the family. I want to know about your neighborhood. So let's take a couple of steps back. I'd like to kind of share with you the practice where I am. Literally over the past year, I was able to go into Trenton, New Jersey, which is one of our really lower social economic it's our capital in New Jersey, but it's sick. When I say sick, I want to take it as I walk around the neighborhood and people are just outside all night. People are literally selling drugs. People are addicts are kind of walking around like it's something out of the 80s almost. But this is 2021 and it's happening. The street. So the building where what I was able to purchase and set up a whole wellness center there. We've been virtual, but we're hoping to go live and in person this September. But I still go there at least every other day. I'm there and I'm just walking around and I'm just getting a feel of the community there. And it's sad. All right. And so I want to know more about the people and the community that's there so I can be able to help out. People literally come up now. So what's this? What's going on here in this building? You know, I can't just go into a building or into a community and be the outsider. I have to immerse myself in there to have a better understanding because I got to be a part of the community. So one thing we have to be able to know and understand is you might be working with the community, but you also sometimes well a lot of times if you're going to work well and be effective is become a part of that community. Okay, so we're not just listening to it, but we also have to better understand the institutional aspects of this. So we have to open that up in the discussion with the treatment, and it's an element to be a part of, right? And so, what is it? We're looking at education, religion, government. Kathy, when you were mentioning this normalcy part that's not normal anymore, look at that religion. We're not being able to practice not the way we used to in a couple just 1 year ago, right? Maybe we can do it in our home, but sometimes religion was not just the religiosity of it; it was the fact that we were able to commune with another person, right? And so we weren't able to, or access to the government resources, right? So, or education, we're not in school right now, right? What does that look like? That's so big on the radar. Business, work, employment. So there's things right here in the institutional aspect of it. What was the experience of this particular group? I don't know if anyone has any feedback or insight or questions or anything like that, but the institutional aspects. And remember, us being the mental health practitioner, we're a part of the institution. We have to really remember that. People look at the institution sometimes as a monolithic as well, right? You're a part of this, even though you're the individual helping me, but you're operating within it. So, what does that sometime mean to the person, right? How do they look at us as even being able to help? Okay, so then going into the global aspect, which is very connected, right? There's an interconnectivity to this politics, culture, global events, the environment, the media. Whew, that's a lot. But at the same time, we watch the news. How do people interpret the news? Realizing that there's a lot that goes on that plays a role in how I what navigate this life too, navigate my own community. What are the politics here? We're not talking about the red or blue here. We're talking about just the easier aspect of public affairs. What are the public affairs that are going on within my community and how they are impacting me in my everyday life? Right. And so there's more of a global perspective that people have to take into account, but it's not, again, it's not about that red or that blue. It's about that humanistic aspect of what are the affairs that I am now a part of, that I've been a part of, that are events that are going on in my community. Okay. And then the latter part is that lifespan, right? The lifespan is so important. Think about the latter part. We're in almost like, if you're thinking of sports, we're in the fourth quarter here. We're talking fourth quarter. All right. And we know adulthood is broken down into those three also sub aspects of life. So you have adulthood, older adulthood, and then I don't like to use the word older, but it's the older sometimes too. And so it's the older to the middle and then the older. And so what does all that mean? Even when we're talking, if we were in a group. So that's where the application of the results really kind of comes in, where um this is what happens here. And I want to stay on this slide for a little while because this is what starts to really qualitatively come out when I started doing and listening to not just the numbers. I started listening to the communicate what was being communicated to me from the people that were taking the 5 factor wellness inventory. Right, we don't just get a whole wellness score, but I want to be able to talk about this. And these were some of the things that came up. So take a look at these nuances. Kathy, you talked about retirement. I'm saying you because I see you, okay? So I don't see anyone else. So I don't want to be exclusive, but that's who I see right now. I hope maybe there's a few other people in the room. But which of these areas really starts to stand out? Because each one of them is where we're going to stay for a while, just to give it some context and some body around the area, and how the people who are baby boomers 65 and up, or even entering into that realm too. Right, we can be entering into it because I can still sometimes maybe even feel like, wow, I'm going through this right now. So what is it? What stands out?
I would say identity.
Okay, the identity. And I say identity as well. And I want to understand why you said that. And I put that with the asterisk next to it, and what people came up with when they were sharing with me their narratives. So identity was one of the lowest areas for people who were African American. Wellness identity for the men was the lowest out of, and this was over 200 participants of my studies, for actually just one study too. So I want to know why identity.
Sharita, can you clarify if identity was a positive thing or a negative thing?
Identity was not necessarily taken as positive or negative. It was just my identity. I was struggling with it. Let me go back and tell you what the identity. So when we're looking at identity, it's in that essential self. If you can look here, the spirituality, self care, gender identity, and cultural identity. So if we're to kind of define it objectively, that's what they were talking about. So the participants answered, well, when you're thinking of your essential self, the questions that were posed revolved around spirituality, self-care, their gender, what that meant, and how they described it, and then the cultural piece to it. Does that make sense? And so when it was identity, it was like, can you talk about that a little bit more to me? What themes kind of came up for you when, and I'm talking to a client now. When you're talking about your identity, what was it for you? What is it for you? And I wanted to talk, and this was at a literally when I did the group in the community program, it was at a in New Brunswick, New Jersey, and we were literally, because I had already put the program together now because I wanted to apply the results, right? I wanted to apply, like, this was the problem. I want to see how now I can engage a community. And so who showed up was the 65 and up group. I didn't say this is the group that I want to show up, but 65 and up made the room, right? And there were about 20 people that showed up over a 10-week group, and they talked about these aspects of their identity. What else stands out?
Physical health stands out for me. Just because as you age, as you have that phase of life, you're transitioning 65 and older, there are definite changes in physical abilities and capabilities. So much so that even going to the doctor for annual checkup, part of their screening now is, do you have a bar in your shower to hold on to?
Mm-hmm.
Was walking through a client is, I can't believe the doctor asks me that every time. I'm fine. I don't need that. I don't. And so we talked about having it and not needing it as a preparation instead of as a deficit. Oh, I'm less than. Because again, folks who grew up in that generation, if you were a wheelchair user, you were less than.
Mm-hmm.
If you were disabled, then oh, you were institutionalized, you were done. And
Yeah.
so it's a different framework on how accepting. And no, I'm not old. I can still drive, I can still this. And it's that whole physical ability and health wise.
And just to kind of go further into that, you can see how that physical health and the identity relative to the ageism connect, right? And so it's perspective too, right? And so when we're talking about wellness as it is defined by this approach, it's that subjectivity to it. How do you feel about your identity and how it connects to your physical health? A lot of times when we're talking to some people, when we're talking about that physical health, it's really how the health is carried,
Mhm.
right? It's not sometimes about the feeling or the cognitive aspect, the that's honestly in a decline, so to speak, right? That's kind of the given, right? My physical health is going to decline in my fourth quarter. Okay. However, how do I feel about it? And what can I do about it? And that's the wellness part. That's that positive aspect of the positive psychology that goes in wellness. So, how can I now encourage this person to go to the doctor? But, however, I got to think about access, right? I got to think about, well, can they get to the doctor? Within this last year, their appointments have been far and few. Were you going to raise your hand?
Nope.
Oh, I thought you were about to say something. Okay. So yes, so we got the physical health, we got the identity. And those are I want to go into what I have that asterisk next to the color line. If any, does anyone have any ideas about that?
Can you say that again?
The color line, because that came up quite a bit.
Oh,
For,
that piece under identity for the color line.
yeah.
Okay.
I guess I would want clarification. What do you mean by the color line and how that comes up with identity? Because of like Black Lives Matter happens right now, or because of
The over time and how salient it has been. And so if you've had under here the generational problems. It's the interconnectivity to that color line because of the racial trauma that's happened over time within that population too. So if you're considered, or if you are a part of a marginalized group, how have you dealt with it over time? And what most people came up with was the either white or black.
Mhm.
Right. And it's just like, wow, how does that play a role in your life? You're like, I don't want it to. But then when people talk about this, goes back to all the way to 1903 with W.E. Du Bois, when he said in the 20th century, the problem is going to be of the color line in American society. And it's just like, wow, 1903 is when that was said. We are going through that now, and we can see the how it's impacted. When I think someone said, just the era of COVID, there's like COVID's a pandemic, but so has the racial aspect within COVID and in the pandemic. That's literally now manifested itself. You're just like, wow, what's going on? We got the biggest thing I think people say is the George Floyd thing, right? But then you know what? That's just because it's now been televised, and it's in this social idea, society, and the ideas of justice and the political and the feminist approach. When we're talking about mental health, the feminist approach to counseling, that whole thing, the personal is the political. Right? That's one of the tenets of the feminist approach to mental health treatment. So we have to be able to understand, like, wow, we got generational problems. And so it's like, why is the color line so salient still? Right? And so one thing that has happened, we have to be careful because it's really been a development that's going over. And so it's like, does that matter? Yes, to this population it has, because it's played a role for what they've been fighting for. We just had the the anniversaries of the civil rights acts of the 1964 and 65. They're literally up where they're on dockets in certain states, whether they're going to be renewed or not, for just voting. It's like, wow. And so if that's what this group fought for in the 60s, they're now having to revisit it in their older age, and how that's playing a role in their lives today. And so that's where a lot of this has literally come in. So, and it's just like, I didn't think about it. And if you weren't in that, of course, you're not going to think about it, but it's on their mind. So I want to give them an area and a safe space to be able to talk about it, because it comes up as fear and stress.
Mhm.
I just had a new client this last week, and it's like, I needed to see you because I have a fear that something is going to be, what if I'm not going to be able to vote? And that's coming out as stress. And I need to go back into the workplace this coming fall. And I feel like that's going to be, my fear is going to be perpetuated because I'm the only one that looks like me in my workplace. Just like, wow, look at how all of that comes together. And you think about it as being compartmentalized, and that's not really an area. But then you think about this person being fearful of just going out the door, and I don't want to be a hashtag because now I'm going back to work and I'm just coming off the radar of all of these different things that have happened across the last couple of years of life. And now these things are in government again. Look at Texas. Right. And so it's just like, that's something. And I've had to actually work with clients, and I had part of our self-care plan for her, because one thing, I'm going to get to it in a few minutes, but every client makes a self-care plan that comes through my practice. Right. And so the thing about it is like, that's really legit. At one time, we would consider that person paranoid. But how come the paranoia is not something I can't um, diagnose them with some type of paranoia when it's really it's legit? And so that's where this comes in. Right, I have this picture and big bold as a poster on the window of the practice in the community, and I see people that walk by this and they just stand there and look at this every day. And so sometimes I'll sit outside because it's summertime, and I'm like, you want to know more about that? Come on in, let's talk about it. And so we have to understand these subjective experiences within the group. Right, how are people going into it? So you can look at that you can look at the theory, but how do I now break it down into the self-care plan? I want to be able to have a discussion with my client in each of these areas. In each of these areas, I want to have them process. And I have me a nice little asterisk next to this in my notes, but I want to be able to go through the risk and protective factors for each one of these areas, because it's not about all about what's wrong, especially according to the wellness approach. I want to know what's right as well, because I want to help you to engage yourself in order to be able to use what's been going well, in order to use that in order to reduce the risk factors that are in your life, because it's almost an existential aspect of it where you're thrown into something that you can't help. Right? I can't turn off what my phenotypical features look like when I enter into a space, right? And so knowing that that's sometimes the thing that hinders me or that hinders my experience in a particular space, I want to be able to reduce that barrier, because I need to walk around with it, but I can reposition how I carry it, all right, to make it a what? Something that I can encourage myself with. And so understanding myself in each one of these areas of life leads to the self-care plan. And here's an example of how to literally compartmentalize an aspect of putting the self-care plan together according to the 8 dimensions that I just had up there, right? And so this was just an example that I found. So having them go through each one of those areas, not just to process and to talk about it, but then how can we get to a point of having some solution focused ideas so that I can get them to do something about each one of these, maybe weekly, right? And so physical, let's do something physical. So for the next week, this is what you can do because you came up with this, right? And so they're co-collaborations too. I'm not just the expert, but they're the expert on their lives. So I said that every client develops one, but I also have, because I'm a counselor educator, my students come up with this to begin every semester, right? And it might seem like it's not a part of the class, but it really is a part of the class. All right, because I want them to be able to practice different models of care that they can help their future clients with. So being able to be a part of that. And then going into this, because we're coming up on my 50 minutes here. What can we do? This is actually my last slide here. Make it didactic, right? And so it's you teaching, but it's also them teaching us. All right. And so the part where we're teaching is just about being psychoeducational, right? What tools do they have access to? What can I better influence them with as far as encouraging, right? I want to be able to expose them to some things that they don't know. A lot of people, when we're coming from marginalized communities, they know their block. But what about a couple of blocks over? Right? It's usually a whole shift in the community. It's a whole nother community a lot of times too. So I want to be able to walk a few blocks, maybe sometimes just because. So that's where there's a lot of studies on the walkability of a community. That's where we're coming in on that. So how do I help my client to gain more access into their own community? So also be able to provide that narrative counseling. That's another approach that you can use within this area for them to be able to talk about that. Teach me something that you've been doing so I can now in turn use it as a tool to keep you abreast, because when you go through and have that manifestation of the symptoms, sometimes depression, anxiety, self-care goes down, right? We always say the ADLs, attention to daily living. How can I get them to improve those from the basic to the more complex? And the more complex, we're looking at self-esteem. All right, just like what's that? The hierarchy of needs, right? Maslow's hierarchy of needs, very humanistic in a sense, right? And so when you go through, you get to those tools and options. Sometimes it's not just about that mental, but financial literacy, big time problem, right? So what can I do? A little bit of homework. I'm not going to teach this to them because that's just not my area, but I want to be able to give them the tools to say, here's a few resources that you can look into, right? And then I can call on people and say, here's a list that you can now tap into, or we can do that right in session. Who do we need to call, right? What can we look up for you so that you can leave out with a better knowledge base, right? So it goes to that personal, the empowerment and being informed. Sometimes being informed a lot of times makes or leads a person to feel better in each one of these areas, especially the mental, right? I psychologically feel better when I know that I have more options, right? And so each one of these areas, so that's really what we're going into. And I know I don't have a lot of time, and that's why I wanted to just really end it right here, because I want to say that these are some of the things that you want to be able to do to be culturally responsive, and to be able to formulate some programs, incorporate treatment plans, and to start self-care for each person that comes in from that wellness approach and the perspective for the 65 and up, because they're trying to get things in order, right? I want to make sure that I have this in order, because sometimes maybe they are still working, right? That goes back to that work life balance and things like that. And so each one of these areas came up that are more salient and nuanced for the 65 and up, for the marginalized population, for or communities that have a culture that where maybe I've gone through some things in life and now I'm looking at it now as an overall look back. But I want to be really cognizant of where I am today and make things more what purposeful, right? When we're looking at those eight, that latter age group, 65 and up, the adult, middle adult, and older, this is what's going on, and this is what literally stood out as far as evidence-based ideas. So as my stop share, are there any questions? Q&A.
Oh, I think we're good. I always love your presentations.
All right. And so I have 2 minutes to spare. So I just wanted to let you know, if you have any kind of ideas, that 8 dimensions of wellness, there are assessments online that you can find that you can use. It makes for a great conversational piece to create dialogue and processing with clients. So I don't ever want you to walk away with just having heard someone talk about something, but also for you to be able to apply and do something with. So I'm gonna